All right, so we are now into progressivism. We're talking about specifically today the rise of progressivism and what factors led to it. This will be a lot of review from industrialization and urbanization, so a couple units ago, because a lot of those issues related to industrialization, urbanization, all the factory riots, all the strikes, this kind of led to the progressive movement as a political event where we start seeing people growing out of poverty, people being protected by government as opposed to this laissez-faire kind of logic. We start seeing the government taking more of an active role in the protection of people and its citizens as workers. Basically, it's more less about supporting captains of industry and more about curtailing the rights of robber barons. So we'll get to that as we go through this entire unit. So our first goal is to explain the conditions that led to the rise of progressivism. All right, so the progressive movement, we're talking about 1890, so again, industrialization all the way to 1920. So this spans that age of industry all the way through World War I, at least as far as the U.S. is involved in it. Essentially, it's an attempt by the middle class and the lower classes to have state, local, and federal governments address economic and political and social reform. So before this, it was very private, but we start seeing more and more people getting active in a political method to actually take over and change things. The movement included members of both major parties, Republican and Democrat, as well as third parties that focused on very small issues. So like the rights of workers would have had like Eugene Debs. All these other various people were out there. This is a reaction to the Gilded Age, so that gold Gilded Age where the robber barons made everything so great and wonderful. Well, this is a reaction to that because things weren't always so great and wonderful, especially if you're in the middle and lower classes in society. All right, the emergence of the social gospel. Urban slums and poor, they were unsanitary. This is a time period where buildings that would have 15 stories would have like one bathroom or no bathroom. Sometimes the bathroom would be outside an outhouse. Sometimes you would throw your matter, whatever you want to call it, your unsanitary result of you eating and taking care of yourself out a window. I mean, there would be poop in the street from horses, from humans, all this stuff. It was just a nasty time to live in a city. Usually inhabited by mostly immigrants, very poor, so it disenfranchised a minority of people. It disenfranchised the poor in general. It disenfranchised minorities, religious, immigrant, national minorities, whoever. They tended to be hurt by these city situations. The dumbbell tenement. Remember, this is review from the industrialization era. Often, you look here, there's no bathroom. There's no bathroom on this little list. So the bathroom often would be outside, or, you might just have a bucket in your room and you might dump it out a window depending on where you were in the street. Kind of nasty. Here's some images of the urban slums. Look just how busy it is and how little there is actually as far as cleanup going. The picture on the right is actually probably a time period when it was pretty clean. The one on the left, it's pretty daggone dirty down there. All right, the social gospel. Ministers, especially Protestant Christians, so we're talking about like the Baptist, Lutheran, Methodist denominations, all those started coming together and saying salvation is linked to living a life like Christ. So basically you come out and say, well, if I help alleviate poverty and despair in the world, I could win salvation. Okay, I'm going to get into heaven by being nice and doing good deeds. That's essentially what we're talking about here. Jane Addams was the co-founder of the Hull House, so we talked about this during the industrialization era in reaction to the Gilded Age. Basically, she was a spokesperson for racial justice, anti-war activism, and quality of life issues. We're focusing here mostly on the racial justice and quality of life. Anti-war would be more about World War I. But essentially, we're talking about somebody who was doing those good works under this whole idea of social gospel to basically promote the interests of lower-class people who just don't have the money, lower socioeconomic status people, and try to make their lives better. Basically, achieve salvation and just, feeling good and warm, fuzzy feelings by doing good works. Muckraking. Okay, definitely have this in your repertoire of vocab words. Muckraking is the exposing of corruption. Like you're literally raking up muck. Usually done by newspapers, but like in this cartoon right here, you see muckraking, some muck. That's Teddy Roosevelt. So sometimes the president and politicians get involved in muckraking, just kind of uncovering this whole nastiness of like political machines, Plunkett at Tammany Hall, all that kind of stuff. Just trying to basically deal with the corruption that was so common in the late 19th century and early 20th century. All right, Lincoln Steffens was a leading muckraker. He published The Shame of the Cities. It exposed business and government corruption. So he would have been out there exposing things like political machines and graft, and all these terrible things that basically kept bad people in power to basically hurt lower level people. His goal was to provoke public outcry and promote reform through this publishing. And there's a picture of the actual. There's him, and there's his cover art for I think this is a later printing of his book. All right, Ida Tarbell. Now, she was a turn-of-the-century female muckraker, so we're talking about late 1900s, late 1800s, early 1900s. She exposed specifically, she was a muckraker as it related to John D. Rockefeller and the Standard Oil Trust. So she basically took on the biggest billionaire of the time with this book, basically exposing how business was done and how they kind of just kept workers down and put in stifle competition, all these other things. So she was she was female, that's revolutionary right there, and she's taking on like the biggest billionaire the world has ever known all at once. So kind of crazy. And then Upton Sinclair. This guy's probably the most famous because his book The Jungle, which was a novel, so it wasn't technically like what do you call it? It wasn't nonfiction, but it was based on a lot of real things. He exposed the brutality of the life of the poor and and specifically related to the meat packing industry because his main character works in a meat packing industry. Actually, his book The Jungle led to the passage of the Meat Inspection Act in 1906 and the Pure Food and Drug Act later on, like the USDA, that came out of that eventually. I mean, he had a huge influence. This is a direct quote from the actual book. There would be meat stored in great piles in rooms, and the water from leaky roofs would drip over it, and thousands of rats would race about on it. It was too dark in these storage places to see well, but a man could run his hand over these piles of meat and sweep off handfuls of dried dung of rats. These rats were nuisances, and the packers would put poisoned bread out for them. They would die, and then rats, bread, meat would go into the hopper together. This is no fairy story and no joke. The meat would be shoveled into carts, and the man who did the shoveling would not trouble to lift out a rat even if he saw one. There were things that went into the sausage in comparison with which poisoned rat was a tidbit. So we're talking about basically there's rats, poison, rat feces, and poop being put into a hopper. That's like this big container that goes into the meat grinder. And they're grinding up meat with all this stuff in it and then selling it to people. And they don't even stop it. So, and one of the famous quotes of this, a regulatory person said, Mr. Sinclair, if even 1/4 of what you say in there is true, we need to change things. Because it was just a nasty industry. There was no regulation. There were no laws saying, hey, your meat can't have rat poop in it. That kind of stuff. So they just let it go because that was the easiest way to make money was to have no regulation. Just throw it in there. Hey, eat rat poop just adds extra weight. So guess what we're going to do it. Very nasty time period. All right, so there's a muckraking cartoon. You see the meat scandal. This is all about Teddy Roosevelt after Upton Sinclair's book, kind of taking on the meat industry and investigating what's going on. And they did find some nastiness going on. All right, take a look at this. This is a cool cartoon about the phases of Teddy Roosevelt's life. He has a huge life. So we're talking about he starts off as an explorer, then he's an historian, then he's a police commissioner, naval secretary under McKinley, where he's a rough rider. He goes and fights the Spanish-American War. Then he's the governor of New York. Then he's the vice president under McKinley. Then he becomes president. Then he's the peacemaker because he's the guy that wants to basically stop a lot of the wars that are relating to American imperialism. And then finally he's the mighty hunter of all time. He became a very well-known naturalist and conservationist because he liked to hunt. So he'd go off to Africa on safari. Like a lot of very famous trophies, like trophy hunts, are still in existence today that Teddy Roosevelt shot. But he was also a very big conservationist, wanted to conserve national parks so that they're like our legacy to our children, like conserve these animals, take care of them. He's a very big naturalist, so he's actually very well-known figure in the idea of nature and conserving things. All right, there's now this is the meat packing industry, but you'll notice you got the workers with their giant, super awesome meat cleavers, but then you also have inspectors. So the inspectors are starting to come in. They're taking care of the meat factory now. There's some more meat factory inspections going, making sure the meat's not tainted or dirty. This is all, again, related out of just one guy's book called The Jungle about the meat packing industry and how terrible it was. All right, Jacob Reese, this is a little bit of a review. He wrote a muckraking book on the plight of urban immigrants. So, again, this is like how the other half lives. They're just taking pictures of just the squalor that these people lived in in the early 1900s. And his goal was not to show this to the people who were like experiencing it because they knew it already. He was trying to show it to the other half, the rich half. How people, because during this time period, if you were wealthy, you never saw the poor. You didn't hang out in the same places. You never went to the same places. You were so separate, you might not even know this is going on. So his book, How the Other Half Lives, is trying to show the wealthy half how the poor half in the society live right now. All right, and then you got Frank Norris. He was considered by many to be the U.S.'s first naturalist author, and he believed in social Darwinism, although that belief system is kind of now defunct. So he would have been okay with like robber barons because he believed, hey, the survival of the fittest, that's how it works in business too. So Rockefeller should be in charge because he's the best one, he's the strongest, he's the best one who can survive. But that kind of idea slowly lost favor and has been mostly discredited. All right. If you watch the America Story of Us Cities episode, you should know about this story already. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. All right, so there was a garment factory in New York City caught on fire, and 146 women and girls were exposed to these conditions, basically died. The death toll was so high because of the locked exit doors. The doors were unlocked, may have been less dangerous. Now, the problem is the reason why they were locked was they only wanted one exit in and out of that building because they wanted to make sure that the girls and ladies weren't stealing any fabric. So the reason these girls and women died was basically to protect the company's bottom line. It was a very nasty, terrible event in New York history, and certainly the worst up until that point that wasn't involved with the Civil War and the draft riots. So this would be what the shirt factory looked like. It's basically a sweatshop. I mean, it is. It was just a sweatshop, crowded, hot, poor working conditions, nasty situation. There's the image of the fire as it's taking place. That's the aftermath. And this is really sad. These are some of the women that knew they were going to die, so they just jumped out the window hoping for the best. They didn't want to die in the fire because that'd be horrifying and painful. They'd rather just die a quick death splatting on the ground. Very, very unfortunate. Very terrible. And it highlighted a lot of the issues as it related to just working conditions of the poor. All right, this is Max Planck and Isaac Harris. These are the guys that owned the factory. They were indicted, which basically means they're charged with the crime and the deaths of Margaret Swartz, one of the factory workers that died. The trial began 8 months later, but it was done in 18 days, and they were acquitted. They were found not guilty. That kind of also spurred more reform because all of a sudden, like, well, these guys were in charge of the factory, and it was their fault that that these women died, and nothing happened to them because of the way the laws were. So there was a lot of reform happened as a result of this because nobody was held accountable, and there was no justice to what had happened. All right, so bridge map. Just understand who these people are. Again, this is a lot of review. You got John D. Rockefeller's oil. The Vanderbilt family is railroad and train. J.P. Morgan's finance, banking, and electricity later on. And Andrew Carnegie, he is steel.